Matthew, yeah, we're happy that you're here to with people from all over Ontario to present your fabulous webinar on conversation and observations in the math class. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Matt.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here again. Maybe a few people were here on November 1st. I did a session as well, so it's great to be doing this again. For tonight's session, I just briefly mentioned the blog post. And for myself, I think that realizing that kids need to talk to other kids and kids need to talk to their teachers in the math classroom was a bit of a revelation. And it would seem like it shouldn't have been, but I suppose when I first started teaching, it's not that that wasn't quite the norm yet, but there was still some teachers for whom it was sort of all silent all the time and take up the homework, and that's sort of what I felt like I had to be as a math teacher. And guess what? It just didn't fit. So over the course of a number of years, everything sort of changed. And the big thing was realizing that if kids talk to other kids, then their thinking will be so much the better, and you will know they're thinking so much more. And to the main theme of this session, that assessing them will be easier. And that's even easier than pencil and paper only, because if you want to know what they're thinking, just ask them. Okay, but as I said, I mean, even to this day, some math teachers aren't used to thinking that way. So that's where we started. And so I am in Peel District School Board Effective Mathematics Resource Teacher. And you can find me on Twitter if you like. So I attempt to enhance the content. So the pad that we'll be using tonight, I did tweet, and it is wide open to the public. So when I reached out to some people I know who might have some thoughts about assessment as well. And if you're a tweeter, you know it's a valuable tool for teachers these days. So please feel free to tweet as well. During the November 1st section, there was actually a lot of tweets that came in. You can, if you tag at OTF_PD, they'll get the mention. And if you tag myself as well, I won't miss it as well. But strongly recommended, being Twitter teachers. And public learners, I should say as well. If you can, it's a great thing. Okay, I'd like to start with to be transparent about my beliefs. I do believe that teaching is an intensely personal act, and although there are some practices obviously that are better than others, and some things that we should and should not do, I do think that where we stand, there are many, many personal choices that we make, that teaching is an action that reflects our own values as well. And that's where I stand. And that's why in the next couple slides I just want to tell you what I believe about math teaching and learning. So in this one, you know, I spent a lot of time thinking about what mathematics is, and so what it is in classrooms. And there's a lot of different definitions out there, and I've just been using this one a lot lately. So the extension of common sense by other means. And if you read the Jordan Ellenberg book, it is a great book. There's not one single equation in it, not one. It's just common sense, like he says. But I think we don't often let kids see mathematics as the extension of their intuition or an arm of their common sense. Okay, we develop the other means, but we don't tie it to common sense. You know, and commonly we might say that we don't bring it into the real world enough, and that can be part of it. So the kid in the picture had concluded that a certain soft drink was the biggest rip-off ever. And that's the sort of thing that we want kids to say. We want them to see it as common sense. That was first. And second sort of thing that I've really come to believe, that classrooms should be open spaces for thinking. And that's why I always use the picture of the kid with the blank page ready to go. But whether they're talking, writing, or thinking, they need to be open spaces. I will tweet in a minute. Dr. Chris Sertam has an excellent recent monograph on math classrooms as thinking spaces. But they must be. Thirdly, we all do better as math teachers when we let student thinking lead. And, you know, we could just flip from page to page in a textbook, but that won't tell us about their thinking. Okay, that would be letting the book lead or the resource. But if we let their thinking lead, that can inform how we plan our math lessons. That can inform all of our assessment and all of our instructional choices. And that's very, very important. Related principle, and I gave a bit of a TEDx talk recently about this, that math classrooms should be places of wonder, of surprise and wonder. And so the kid in the little sticky note had said, I wonder when pi ends, or if it does. And that's the sort of thing that we want. And I do find that with mathematics now, there's so much on the internet and on YouTube. It's less mysterious and more cultural than ever before. And kids will wonder if we let them. So that's one of my principles, wonder. Okay, and this brings us to, I'm going to actually use the poll tool for this one. It's just a little screen capture of the EQAO. I actually forgot. I think it must be grade 6 from the look of it. But I want to know who gives regular or unit tests in mathematics now. So if you say yes with the polling tool, that will mean you do give regular unit tests. And please use the red X for no if you do not. Remember, it's anonymous, but there's no judgment anyway. If you can just take a couple minutes to think about that, just regular basis or unit tests or as a large part of your assessment, and click yes or no. Well, I'm just going to take about 2 minutes for that. Okay, so 9 say yes and 19 say no, and that's really, really interesting to me. And I'm enjoying the comments. Some of the units, and some people say, very, very interesting to me. It'd be interesting if more of the people who picked either choice would say sort of what you're thinking, because it really, really helps us. Yeah, just the odd one. And so for me it becomes interesting, choice of what problems to do. For me it becomes really interesting to think about which units are suitable to tests and which simply are not. Okay, but that's interesting results. I wonder if 10 years ago it would be the same or maybe a little different. Okay. Why did I have this one here? This probably belonged more at the beginning. I'm going to go back and address a couple of the points first. Skip ahead to this one. Just picking up on Jessica B., what you said, in my personal thoughts, I just put a little screen capture of just one of those sort of worksheet type tests you can generate, adding and subtracting 2 integers. And I had sort of thought, well, you know, by the time I had left the classroom most recently, just 2 years ago, I was just giving small quizzes, and it was on things like adding and subtracting integers. But again, that was the personal choice. And what I kind of thought was, well, I can just check for this one skill And it's easy to do if I give, I don't know, 10. There's 20 here, but if I give even 10 adding and subtracting integer questions. But the truth is that most kids who couldn't do it, I already know that, right? Because I'm in the room with them every single day, which is what this session is about, watching them and talking to them. And I do still think from Charlotte Brown that using the achievement chart, I definitely used to do that. And I know a lot of our high schools, that's still sort of the norm, where we separate it into knowledge, thinking, communication, and application. And actually some of our high schools have just thinking assessments, which is really interesting. So if you were to think of, again, with the integers examples, if you were to think of separating out thinking about integers and conceptual matter versus the skills you do with it later, like adding and subtracting them, that can be useful. Okay, and we have performance tasks coming up. And I definitely used to enjoy coming up with some bigger problems where it worked, and using those as the unit assessment. So in other words, can you tie a lot of the skills and concepts together into an interesting project, performance task, larger assessment? I used to enjoy that as well. I put this in, so I'm just going to go back to it. Oh, I know why I put it in, actually. This is from some school board materials around, I think, 1991. And it was saying then that the school board believed that math practices were changing so much that parents might not recognize it. And we still sort of say that now, 25 years later. And I do think that we've come leaps and bounds with our understanding of assessment since then. But you may think if you were to stop giving a test tomorrow in mathematics, depending on the community you were in, parents might or might not be all over you. For me, I found when I gradually phased out tests that a few parents asked here and there, for example, in the interviews that just passed. But for the most part, the kids were progressing well, and they knew that I knew the kids. And the kids were motivated to learn, but most importantly that I knew them. So sometimes you'll find that if you take the test away, if you do give them, that sometimes parents don't care as much as you think. What really matters is that you know their children. And anyone can feel free to comment on that if you've totally taken tests away. I know some teachers have fully taken grades away, which is related. So we have lots of notes coming in about anecdotal notes, observations, and that was Amanda Y. Accountable group work, that's really, really important. And the consolidation being so important. Okay, we have lots of great stuff there. This is the part where we're going to drop in one link to a website. So Learn, Teach, Lead, which is the province, and it's where they host their curriculum videos, has rebranded itself as the Learning Exchange. Okay, but all the stuff that's on there is the same. Now this site is a standalone site they developed, hence the /mathematics. So what you have to do, I actually have a section on there called Observations and Conversations, and I spoke to them, and the other people that spoke were Peel teacher Nicola, ministry person Connie Quadrini, sort of spatial reasoning expert Nora Newcomb, and Joe Bowler is on there as well, who you likely know. If you scroll to my section, I'm talking about some of my assessment beliefs, and there is a 48-second and a 35-second video clip where I'm just talking some things about assessment. So if you want to follow the link, scroll down to the Observations and Conversations section and just read the few words and listen to those 2 clips, which total 2 minutes or less. And we'll just come back in 4 or 5 minutes. Okay, very interesting comments. I forgot when I talked about questions leading to more questions, but that was interesting, right? Because I actually, one of my favorite examples of how I came to think about math teaching and learning. So in around 2002, when I was starting out, we had the, I say affectionately, master of old school math teaching. So she literally had a binder with not just a worksheet from every day. She had like 10 adding and subtracting integer worksheets, and there was a method to picking which one she used. And she was really, really new at math, and kids came out really knowing it. But nobody ever talked to each other, so they'd silently approach the desk if they needed a question. So questions were only between teacher and student, right? And so what I found was as soon as it was opened up to everyone talking to each other, particularly kids talking to kids, there was more questions. And there was more answers too, because kids can answer kids, I can answer them. So I forgot about that. And as far as parents asking for proof, that's a really good point. And I typed a comment about that. By the end, I was saying, you know, we have this informed professional judgment thing, and my own observations, so things that I have seen, things that I have observed, things that I've written down, and the written work, I mean, it's all part of the same set of proof. And if I go back, I just doodled COP on the screen, and they just captured me doing that because it's kind of funny, but I was doing the assessment triangle. And so as you know, typically that triangle would look like, let me redraw it. So typically it would look like, you know, no, that didn't even work. I'm trying to say the P is the long side here. Maybe somebody else can think of a way to draw that. I think you can draw on the screen. But so typically it would be all of that. It's not really working for me. A lopsided triangle, if you get the point. Whereas really it might be more an equilateral triangle. Somebody should try it. Or more so lots and lots of observing in the moment and lots of talking and then just a few products. Okay. And you might have that colleague who always has that giant stack of marking, right? And they probably mark too much. That even happens in middle school. And I know that happens to our high school colleagues as well. So the point is, we all do know that typically we've overvalued the products. Okay, and so in many, many senses, mathematics is this purely objective, well, science. Okay, so if I prove, for example, some theorem, if I was a mathematician, it'd be indisputably true. And I think because of that, we see it as the more objective subject. Okay, but there's right and wrong answers, and there's also reasoning, and there's what actual mathematicians do, and there's what kids do. Okay, and that's not always the same thing. But I think sort of that's how that comes about, and that we're just afraid of having the wrong answers. Okay, the policy bottom line, and it truly, truly is, and I don't need to lecture anyone about it. Occasionally I hear the odd story of teachers who probably haven't really engaged with it, but I mean, it is 2010, and I know that everyone's looked at it at least, but it still quite clearly lays out where we need to be, okay, including the triangulated assessment and then evaluation in the end. It's not like there haven't been bumps along the road. A lot of our work this year is with our high school teachers, and for some of them, you know, the assessment triangle's still too lopsided. Some of them, some, not all. But so we're slowly coming along, and so for some of those high school math departments, it's actually the final evaluations they're talking about right now. And some of them have switched, some of them have stuck with the traditional exam, some of them switched to different sorts of formats. There's a whole lot of different things out there. Okay, but we have the policy bottom line. Oh, that really didn't turn out well. I'm going to try and do something for that. So what this is, and I missed the citation, but it came from some of our Peel stuff. So they're doing some work on assessment, but these are the 7 principles from growing success. So are fair, transparent, and equitable to all students. Support of all students, including those with special education needs and those who are learning the language. First Nation, Métis, and Inuit. That's so important. So for those involved with the Ministry Renewed Math Strategy at all, you'll know that the learner profiles and special education is a huge focus this year. So carefully plan to relate to the curriculum expectations, and you have learning goals from there. Are communicated clearly to students and parents. And that's because you can't hit a moving target. Okay, I'm going to circle number 5. So ongoing, varied in nature, and administered over a period of time to provide multiple opportunities. I do think we find, again, if we were to just say the test has happened, it's over, and you don't get a chance to fix it up, you know, here's your C, here's your D, or if you give number grades, here's your 42%, that's bad. But also we talk about the most recent. So if I am doing 4 strands of math this term, and I'm in elementary, from grade 1 to 8, and it should never be too late for me to go back and check the kids' understanding, because skills and understanding grow over time, and where I'm at in the beginning may not be where I'm at in the end. So number 6, ongoing and descriptive feedback, is an interesting one. If you've ever taught writing or reading, but I'm thinking writing in particular, where you're giving that feedback on how to improve the piece of writing, whether it's a poem or an essay, it's more second nature to us. But I think math teachers need to think like that as well, and we'll do a little more on that later. And self-assessment, which is number 7, we'll talk about. Okay, and the final question was, how are these 7 fundamental principles visible in my practice? And I think it's so worthy to note. Sometimes you go to these ministry things or the PD, and then, well, you feel like you have to be perfect because you're going to see these 7 things. But it's not really like that, and people shouldn't be making us think that it's like that. So we're all at a different place in our learning and our implementation, and what's more, we have different strengths. But certainly these 7 principles are ideals that we're working towards. This one, just what's underneath that just got messed up was that it's from the same Peel monograph. But so it talks about how if our beliefs and our values about learning connect to our assessment practices, everything is going to be so much better. You see, and that's why I couldn't just do worksheets, or I couldn't just assess through tests. I knew something was wrong, and I didn't like it, and I wasn't comfortable wearing that hat, and I just had to figure it out for myself. But I think this quotation is also more broadly about assessment practices. So for their just stick, it's not just some guy in a webinar or the resource teacher that comes to your staff meeting or the ministry person telling you what's best to do. It's you've thought about it and you've connected it to your own beliefs, because that matters. Okay, so for the most interactive thing tonight, personal assessment principles. So at the very beginning, and is also in this Padlet, so you can either copy it off the screen or we'll drop it in the chat box as well. The Padlet's going to be the main spot. And what I just, given everything that I've said about how personal this is, if you don't mind dropping your own beliefs, you can do a longer Padlet post. You just double click on the screen and type. You can put any links that you like, screen captures, photos to add to it. But to me, this is the collective knowledge building part and where we learn from each other. So I don't usually like to come in as an expert per se, but I do like to come in as somebody who helps build knowledge. And if my appeal to the Twitter world has worked, then some people will have added to it. And perhaps as you add to it, and I do feel like we need at least 10, maybe a little more, maybe even 15 minutes to do it, that you can please add whatever you like. It's an unlimited wall, and also it can be a takeaway. So you can, if interesting links get shared and bots, you can use it later. And so you can just bookmark it and save it. Okay, so I'm going to go there as well and see what I can add right now. Okay, let's see what I can do about certificate errors. That should be totally public right now. And some people are adding, but some are getting errors. Okay. Now I have made it so we can comment on each other's. I see it as totally public in the settings, so I can't speak to why some might be having what it's calling certificate errors. So I see the settings as completely public. As a matter of fact, would appear in Google. Those with access can write. No admin approval needed. Okay, so that's all right. So there's an incredibly high level of discourse happening through the Padlet and collective constructive knowledge building of the best kind. And as such, we need to keep going for at least 5 more minutes, but feel free to comment on other people's. There's amazing stuff going on there. It's knowledge building of the best kind. And I'm never disappointed by all my teacher colleagues. It's great. So let's keep going. But do comment on other people's. I'll try and do some more comments as well.
Yeah, and we're leaving the mics off, just so don't be alarmed if it's quiet.
Okay, I think I'll start talking a little bit. I do think with anything technological, there are some potential problems. Sorry for anyone who had that. I thought the Padlet was a quite simple tool, and maybe you use it in the classroom. But it's just there's always the potential for problems, such as the technology. Amazing stuff there. You should consider saving that link to think about later, or perhaps if you yourself are one of the math leads in your school, or you want to change a colleague's mind or open a conversation or share something with a parent, please feel free to do that. I do find it's the best kind of knowledge building, and our ETFO and OSSTF colleagues, all our OCT colleagues, always reward us with their knowledge and wisdom. You can definitely have faith in that. There's terrific stuff in there, very thoughtful. And it's not that we shouldn't ever question any of these messages, right? Because we should and we must. But we seem to have lots of similar viewpoints about how kids learn math, and that's great. So is talking about mathematics your default? I already said that it wasn't for me, and it was only over a number of years that I came to that, and I believe it's only from making mistakes that I improved. And if you want to call that the growth mindset of teaching, I guess it is. Okay, and I'll show you what's pictured, and I just dropped the link in the chat box. So in the picture, we went out to some collaborative inquiries in some schools, and we were in a grade 8 classroom, and we picked Dan Meyer dueling discounts, so one of his 3-act tasks, and you can follow the link and look at it. And we had everything planned out. We knew what we were looking for, so what we expected kids would do, and how we were going to consolidate the lesson and everything. And we were going to look at the work later. Okay, and so the kid that's pictured doing the work just suddenly came to this lightning quick hypothesis, and he had to share it out loud. Okay, and you'll notice that the proof is not on the page. He's just said, if you look at the task, under $100 of cost, indeed a $20 off coupon is better, because it just goes right down to 80, whereas 20% is less than $20 under 100. But at 100, 20% is $20. And so thereafter, $101, $102, $200, $2,000, 20% off will always be better. So even though the thinking wasn't explained on the page, he was able to explain it quite clearly and took the lead in his group. What was notable there, and why I always share this example, because the teacher said, well, he has an IEP. He never talks. And all of a sudden he did. So given the chance to think and share. And that was one of my big lessons. And that's a good task if you want to use it. So there's a close-up right there. And so a powerful hypothesis Now, what's interesting is when you give out an interesting task, sometimes kids will throw out a conjecture right away, and you will need to get them to justify it. And sometimes they throw out a conjecture that's right on. I don't know if you call it intuition. I called it that lightning insight, but it's all in how you reason it out. And you'll notice that if this was the answer to that question, which is better, $20 off or 20% off, it's a correct answer of a kind, but there's very little reasoning. So if this piece of work was the only evidence, we probably wouldn't be able to give it a very high grade, okay, if we were evaluating it. Or if we were assessing his thinking just on what's written. A lot of it's not there. Well, we can't assess what's not there, so we need to just ask him. Okay, and so you want to know what a kid's thinking? Just ask him and just ask her. And that happens all the time. And this was another one of our collaborative inquiries. It was grade 6, and all it was one of these dot patterns. And again, we knew we were looking for algebraic reasoning. We fit it right into the curriculum. So kids are looking at growing patterns, and they're starting to extend it, and either additively or multiplicatively, or they're starting to be able to say something like, okay, 3n plus 1, right? But what this kid saw is groups of 3 being added to each side. And if you've worked with a lot of these growing patterns, you'll know that the way we see them can be very personal and idiosyncratic. But he had this sudden startling insight, and he needed to share. And he needed to share with the class. And so again, if his thinking was just between him and this page, he wouldn't have got to share. And I do think the thinking in this one is fairly clear, because he's shown the groups of 3. But other people may have seen it differently. But that was another example of the kid just bursting out to share. And guess what? There was another one who didn't usually share. And this is my more general slide. It was a very memorable piece of work. What I think it reflects is a problem. It's one of those tug-of-war ones, actually. You can see that if you turn your head sideways. So like a balancing thing. So algebraic reasoning again. And so there's not much there, right? So if I'm assessing, and this is probably grade 6 again. So if I'm looking at overall expectation, yeah, I'm not seeing much there. But surprises can come out of this mess. So in this case, they just kept persisting until they got to the answer. But I think, again, like sloppy, messy piece of chart paper, that's not going to be your final product or the final say on what this kid's thinking. Or it shouldn't be. I mean, can they tell you? Or can they take a different little piece of paper and sort of sum it up? I would hope so. We just have to give them the chance. So if you get pieces of work like this, don't give up. There may be something there. But I call it the murk and the mess. And surprises can come out of it. Okay. This is, you don't need to read the whole paper unless you wanted to, but Kathy Bruce talked about teachers doing collaborative inquiries. Now, I happen to do it as the outsider, going into schools, working with teachers. But she's talking to, I think, classroom teachers. And so given the Ontario focus on collaborative inquiry, what do teachers say? So I was so excited, I just scribbled all over in yellow that quote. And so one teacher said, on problem-based tasks and assessment strategies that provided windows into seeing student thinking. The other big thing I learned is that much of their math thinking is never making the paper in any way, shape, or form. But it doesn't mean they don't have it. And I think that we are now asking the question, what does assessment look like when it's not on the paper? Because we are missing the boat. Okay, and so this was a big revelation for this teacher, as it should have been, and as it would be for many of us. But I think it's that recognition that that we need to look to other forms of assessment. It's just so important. Okay, and as far as what sorts of things to look for, Alex Lawson's book from Pearson is literally called What to Look For, and that's K-2 numeracy. And what it actually is it is a developmental continua for number concepts. I'm just gathering the link to drop in. And this is one example of a developmental continuum. And she starts with counting, so sort of pre-kindergarten and kindergarten. Okay, I've dropped the link in as one example. And she poses the question in that book, what does this child's thinking tell me about what he or she understands? And that can lead to questions like this. Where does this child's mathematical thinking lie in a framework of primary numeracy development? So we can get really, really specific. It's not just that we're making observations and doing nothing for them. Okay, so I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, so I see them come through where they learn to count. So they'll know, for example, that 4 objects is actually 4. Like 4 things matches the digit 4. So that symbol that looks like 4. And when I say 4, you picture that digit. The kids have to learn that. Okay, so also they know cardinality of the set. So they go 1, 2, 3, 4, and they know that the last number is how many objects, right? So these things are fairly standard in how they develop. So if you look back at the Padlet, my brilliant colleague Margaret Allen talked about referring to different developmental continua, because some of these things have been well studied, right? And Alex Lawson goes on to talk about adding and subtracting. And you can follow through on multiplying and dividing after that. So we're not sort of alone, and I think that makes our observations less subjective. Okay, so we can take the curriculum for the grade we have and go to the developmental continuums as well. I think I have, not on the next slide. Skip that one for a second. No, it's in the wrong spot. So I think I've covered this one pretty much. I just like it. Oh, I know why I picked this one. There's always a reason. It's usually the picture. In this one we had, I think, 2, 4, 6, 8 chart papers on the problem we did for our ministry project. And they were all about unit rates, but they all revealed something slightly different. And this was grade 8. So the overall expectation is something like demonstrate an understanding or solve problems with unit rate, but then there's also related things like proportion, rate, ratio, percent. All these things are related. So a lot of these different things were revealed through how the students did the work. So, and this was group work, but if we wanted to, we can get more specific about what each kid did and did not understand. And further, whether it's whole class or small group, deciding where to go next. Okay, so based on what they did and did not understand. Okay, this is another one. I like pictures of messy math. And this happened to be that really, really common problem about shaking hands. So 6 people shake hands with everyone. How many, right? And so they just got up, and kids like chalk, and they just did this diagram. And it just doesn't really mean that much until you hear them explain it. But I think it's an example of where if I had a tape recording of it, or if I took some notes, it was just wonderful to listen to. But that mess itself, it's just not enough. Okay, we need to think of the whole assessment triangle. And wonderings allowed as lesson fuel. So what makes a circle a circle? And now think of this whole task of assessment. Now this is back to grade 8 again, this example. So circle concepts. So am I going to stand up and say, circumference is pi times diameter? Or could I start with an interesting question like this? I didn't ask that, the kids did. But what if you say, what do you wonder about circles? Do kids want to know if there's a perfect circle or not? And can you open up the topic wide, just like that? And I know in the past that a lot of people were talking about interesting contexts. And so sometimes it might be enough to say something like, is a circle perfect? Can you draw a perfect circle? To just open the topic right up. Okay, make reasoning a routine. This is one of my favorite topics, so again I'm going to support it with a blog post if I can find it right handy. Yes. I'm going to support it with, super, thank you. And so I support it with this blog post. So some colleagues and I, when we're out doing this work, we found a few websites that help get kids talking. So we think that reasoning shouldn't just be an event. Assessment shouldn't be an event. It should be seamless with instruction. But then we think about mathematical reasoning. Well, should that be an event or more of a routine? And we think it should be more of a routine because we're used to talking, explaining our thinking, reasoning mathematically. Okay, so I think now we need to take probably 7 or 8 minutes. If you just link through the blog post, follow the link, there's I think 4 or 5 different websites that you can then explore a little bit. So just one example being Fraction Talks is linked through there. Just keeping in mind how these sites would get kids reasoning. Okay, so follow the link to the website. I picked 4, and actually 5 and 6, so technically there's 6 different ones. So which one doesn't belong? If you like, I can start dropping while you explore, I will drop the individual links. So I'll start with which one doesn't belong as one example. I dropped in visual patterns as well. And I just dropped in Estimation 180, which is amazing for getting kids talking. And I just dropped in, there's a great guy named Mark Stamp, and I just found on Twitter a terrific blog post today. It relates a lot to my November 1st session, which was about math is where you find it, using the camera roll. But I think it relates to Estimation 180. Like, you can take anything off your camera roll, like almost anything, and use it for estimation or fractions, right? Just two examples. You see Estimation 180 is used out there. Be interested to know that we used a which one doesn't belong for those who've explored it. We used one with our high school teachers. And then my son came home with the same one in his agenda in grade 1, which is interesting because the curriculum expectations would be different, but it's reasoning that's in common. 6-year-olds can reason and 18-year-olds can reason. So to Jennifer and Stacy, I was recently in a grade 10 applied, and they had, so there's low tech and low cost, right? But they had graph paper laminated, so kids could write on them. It was non-permanent. But I've heard of everything from whiteboard paint for desks, which I think is awesome. Window markers, which is cool but messy. I used to do that. That's a lot of work. If you know John Orr from Twitter, he goes around with these white, I don't know if it's wood, but these large white boards he carries around that he got at Home Depot and just cut into the right size. There's all kinds of options these days. And Peter Liljedahl was mentioned. So he did the research actually that showed that if If kids can write on non-permanent surfaces, they're way, way quicker to put their first mark on the page, which gave me some thoughts because I used to like markers and chart paper. But interestingly, the kids who were interacting privately with the notebook were just as quick to write. So there was something about non-permanent and also perhaps private. So, and I do think maybe like paired or group work with markers is different. But it made me think, because I just used to love the chart paper and markers, and that might not be best for all kids. But there's some really interesting do-it-yourself. Like some schools have whiteboards everywhere, smart boards, but there's really interesting do-it-yourself solutions out there. Okay, well, as we get much closer to the end, so again, we'll drop this link in so you have it. So Metamorphosis Institute out of New York City, and so the founder is a teacher named Lucy West. And this handout has about 27 of what she calls talk moves. And just one of which is a turn and talk. And I've actually seen the turn and talk have incredible results. So I was in a friend's grade 1, and when he said to turn and talk, kids sitting on the carpet turned, faced each other, made eye contact, and talked about math. So from a young age, again, they're not talking about Pokemon, which I have a grade 1, and that's what he wants to do. But they know to talk about math, so it's accountable talk, true to math, true to each other, you know, in the culture of the classroom. But I've also seen it in higher grades, and I actually saw, I think it was a grade 9 applied. The kids, so the desks were like pairs, like rows, but like groups of 2. So the one in front turned to the one behind. But again, it was the structure. I'll drop in my Minecraft link if I get a chance. It was the structure of doing it. And my colleague V put it best. We were doing a session. He said he was skeptical of how much do you explicitly teach talking, like Lucy West's talk moves. And he was skeptical. But again, he saw that turn and talk work. And sometimes you need like just that one thing. Okay. And I use turn to talk as an example because it's in that list. So as over time, I do believe it will probably get a little less formal. But you can start by teaching kids different talk moves. But if you take a look at the list, there's things like adding on to somebody's idea, explaining thinking, whether they're right or wrong. So if your culture is that you will do that and kids will do that, that's big. Students are expected to explain their thinking, but they can challenge each other's thinking non-judgmentally. They can pose questions to each other. So there's some great stuff in that list if you want to use it. Let's see, what do we have time? Well, link or image. So I was going to use the page here. Let me just see what I have next. So I do think I might skip that one and we can use the Padlet instead. But what I had in mind there was after seeing those websites, could you pick one? So if you were talking about, let's say, halves and quarters in grade 1 tomorrow, could you go to one of those websites or your camera roll and get one that would activate student thinking? I'm sure you could. But we had to cover one more big principle was student self-assessment. So we have this image from Lorna Earle's book, so assessment as learning, the base of her pyramid, or learning, and then the of learning, which is the product part, the evaluation part. And she believes that's only the tip of the triangle, or the square-based pyramid, as it were. I tend to agree. And so if the as learning in the base refers to things like, well, metacognition, but really refers to students being able to assess themselves, to answer the question for themselves, how am I doing? And if you think of that pyramid time-wise, we should spend more time doing that. And so if we spend all our time on doing that, and if the assessment for learning is strong, with the feedback we give and the guiding along the way, then the assessment of learning is just the tip of the triangle. I just posed this question for myself, but we just took the infinity symbol and we said, well, we're always thinking assessing and learning are intertwined, as it were. But I said, if assessment's truly not an event, what if it is learning itself? If it's so intertwined that we can't separate them? I think that's an ideal situation. And the fact that we're here right now, we know there's not that much out there about assessment in math, or it's too technical, it obscures things, right? But really, so what if it's so intertwined in the learning process? That's what I was thinking there. Pulled this quote from Hattie and Timperley. So both teachers and students seek answers. Where am I going, and how am I going, and where to next? And if I think of learning goals, which was in the 7 fundamental principles, so we have these learning goals based on curriculum. And so even there, even if I have the best laid out learning goal, I know what I'm looking for, I still have to be responsive to the student thinking to figure out where I'm going next. Another colleague to follow on Twitter, so my friend John, but they used Google Forms and kids were rating themselves. So he actually threw out grades and is in the process for grade 6 as well. Just kids thinking for themselves. So you can use the Google Forms, Google Tools, anything like that to get them to self-assess. I've seen it done for learning skills as well. So just a small example. A nice quote, nice kids thinking. Simple checks for understanding, they might get the most mileage from, like exit tickets at the end of class, which might reveal misconceptions, which we can then start the next class with, or do a mini lesson, or check in with the kid. Thumbs up, thumbs down, depending on the grade, red, yellow, green light. You may find those things work well. Depending on what tools your board uses, Google Forms or other desire to learn other two-way tools, Microsoft, Edmodo, whatever it is. This I very, very deliberately chose not to spend much time on. Why? So everyone has a different computer or device. Every board has different apps, software. A lot of the ministry licenses are the same. But regardless of how you do it, pick one and stick to it. So we actually have Google here in Microsoft Office. If I was in the classroom right now, I know I would use Google Classroom. But depending where you are, maybe Desire to Learn fits. My own child, both children, are actually in Seesaw, which is an app. I get notifications. The grade 1 teacher, as I'll show you, is brilliant for commenting on their work. Explain Everything is another one. And I just mentioned native apps, things that are native to devices, so like the native Apple or Android video or voice recorder, or the camera roll. These are very, very personal choices. My son's teacher in Seesaw, so this is an example of her observing Colin's pattern, documenting it with the photograph, and quoting him. And what's great, I get the notification on my phone as soon as it's posted. But she has used his words to describe him. Okay, so not only are parents happy, and I do like it, but she can use that as the evidence and the documentation. So now this is grade 1, and I'm seeing the proof the whole way. Now, I wouldn't hope that he would have tests in grade 1, but I know what he's doing, okay? I'm not going to ask whatever the grades are in January. I'm going to have seen evidence along the way, and that's important. So Seesaw is just one example. A lot of times you'll see it done in primary. This one was from when I was in the classroom, kid using EduCreations. I think we have the link for this one. It's just like a 45-second video. It is, yeah, so this EduCreations example. Building a pattern with cubes, writing on the screen, explaining it. A small example of the sort of evidence you can take from kids talking. It's easier than it ever has been before with all our devices. Okay, this one was maybe a touch out of sequence. And so when I was talking about Alex Lawson, she's here. So Fosno kits are another example where her landscapes clearly laid out how kids learn the concepts: add, subtract, multiply, divide, proportional reasoning. Prime, which is another one from Nelson, which is Marion Small. And Doug Clements, who's done a lot of them. And I think regardless of which ones you use, you can fall back on the developmental perspective. Okay, and it's a key lesson that even though a kid is in grade 2, doesn't mean they're exactly with what that curriculum expectation says about adding and subtracting, for example. We may have to look more closely at their thinking. Okay. I've typically packed a little too much in, and I do need to be open that I can answer questions. You can put your hand up if you want to talk, but I think we're having good luck typing them as well. Answering any questions, putting any last comments in the chat box. Also, this was from a guy named Michael Pershan, a great teacher from New York City. And he has a blog called mathmistakes.org. And I said, what would you say to this kid? Because if you have a takeaway from this session, it's that their thinking doesn't always make the page, as Kathy Bruce's participant said. And so something has happened here. And so it's, where do we need to go next? And what do we need to ask this kid? So I'm just going to pause and answer any questions, and hopefully drop some more things into the box. But so feel free to ask away as we finish up. And as we do finish up, nobody said these things were easy. I think this develops over a career and a lifetime. And as I said, I've made some mistakes where, early on I thought I just had to give tests in math, or I gave poorly designed tests, or I relied too much on them, or I didn't let kids talk. Nobody said it was easy. And we're not perfect assessors all the time. But we do need to trust our own informed professional judgment, and we do need to pay attention to conversations, observations, and products. Oops.
So thanks, Matthew. That was great. I don't know if there's any questions, because I just do have a couple other things to go through, which will be good timing. Is it okay to go on?
Super.
Okay.
Oh yeah, super. Thank you very much. I'll just answer questions in the box, and thank you.
Yeah, it's good discussion. Just so while people are finishing up, so the first thing is, if we'd really appreciate your input into the sessions, so that OTF and Matthew and the ministry will get some feedback on what you think of OTF Connects and how it helps forward your professional development. So I'm going to there's 3 ways to get to the feedback survey. One of them will be right when you exit out of the session, you'll be directed right to the feedback survey. And the second one is to click on the link. And the third one, it will be in the resources when we send those out with the